Well, this morning we are going to talk a little bit about the Olympics. Did anyone watch the Olympics this past summer? Few people? A couple people? I didn't watch too much of it, but one of the premier track and field events is the relay, the 4x100 relay. And I don't know if you watched it. If you didn't, it's worth looking up. The Canadian team was pretty well regarded in the race. They'd done well leading up to the finals. They made it to the finals where the medals are awarded. And there's 4 runners in the relay, right? Each person in the relay runs 100 meters. And they have to pass a baton as each person exchanges. You run your section, you pass the baton, and then the next person picks up the baton and keeps going. And the Canadians, as the last runner, Andrea DeGrasse, came into play, the Canadians were in 5th. So they were about the middle of the pack. They were not in a position to win a medal. But Andrea is one of the best runners that Canada has had, certainly. And he received the baton, and he's such a strong runner that he took the Canadian team from 5th into 3rd and won a medal for the Canadian team. So we're going to be talking about the relay race a little bit this morning, and keep that metaphor in mind. Now, sometimes today, as we're talking about life, we use the metaphor of races when we talk about life. We'll say things like, life isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, that type of thing, right? We'll use those types of metaphors. Now, I think we can agree that life isn't a sprint. There's portions of sprinting in life probably. And, the metaphor of the marathon may be more accurate because, you have to pace yourself over life. You can't sprint your whole life. We know that, right? It's not sustainable. But I'm going to talk about a different type of race, which is the relay race, as we've already mentioned, and comparing that to the analogy of life. Because the thing is that the sprint and the marathon are both individual races, right? It's just one runner, it's you against the clock, or you against the rest of the field. You have to run the race by yourself. And of course, there's the training and all of that, but the race is an individual race. Whereas the relay is a team race. You have to work together with your teammates and your team members on the relay, and there's a passing of the baton from team member to team member as they all work together in the relay. And I think when we see our lives as part of a relay rather than a sprint or a marathon, it's a more helpful metaphor when we're talking about what life looks like. And we'll get to why as we look at the Bible here. It's not the individual runner in the relay that has to cross the finish line, but it is the baton that has to cross the finish line. The baton is the only thing that goes around the whole track. Each runner only runs a portion of the race. And in track and field, interestingly, a relay race is the only event where you don't have to cross the finish line to win. Only one person crosses the finish line, but there's 4 runners. Now, at Crossroads, one of our values is we grow together because we believe that people grow better together. Same thing, right? Life is not an individual race. We work better together. We work better when we're growing together, when we're helping each other, supporting each other. And instead of seeing our lives as individual races, we're all individuals and kind of somehow put together, if we see ourselves as members of a team, if we see ourselves as members of even a relay race, we can see how the different parts fit together, how the different team members work together, how different people have different roles in the race. And as you look at the relay team, each of the runners, the 4 runners, have different specialties. The person who starts will have to be someone who's fast out of the blocks, right? They got to be quick. They got to get the team up and running and moving. There are runners in the relays who specialize in running the corner because one portion of the relay is running the corners, right? So there's a runner who will be better than the others on the team at just running the curved portion of the track. And the anchor runner, who is Andre DeGrasse in the Canadian team, is the one that's got to bring it all together. Probably the strongest, fastest runner on the team, because they have to bring it home. They have to take what's been done up to that point and finish the race. Each of them has a different role to play. They're all part of the team. And when we see our lives in this way, we can see that our lives are not all about what we each do individually. It's about how we fit together as part of God's plan. It's about playing our role in the race. It's about doing what God has called you to do as part of the team. And our lives are not individual races, but they're a race that connects with other people, with other lives around us. And our personal finish line isn't a line per se where we cross the finish line, but it's a zone. We can call it the exchange zone, just like in the relay, where we take what God has given us and we pass the baton on to the next person who is coming along with us. And in this model, we can rejoice in the victory of other people. We can rejoice in being part of the team, because I don't have to win, you don't have to win, but the team wins. The team wins the race together. And on the relay, it's not just one person, even though the anchor runner, and in the case of the Canadian team this summer, the anchor runner took the Canadian team from 5th to 3rd. They accomplished a very important task. They did what they had to do in finishing the race strong. But even though he is the best runner on the team, he wouldn't have been in position to win a medal for the team if the other runners hadn't done their part. Because one relay runner by themselves cannot win the race. And when you look at the record times, an individual 400 meters, one lap around the track, and compare that to the times of the relay, 4 by 100, the relay runners are faster than the individual 400-meter race, because 4 people running 100 meters can do it faster than one person can running 400 meters, because it's a longer race. They can't keep as high of a pace for the full 400 meters as 4 people only running 100 meters each can do. The team is stronger than one person by themselves. When we work with each other, we work with the team, we're stronger than we would be by ourselves. You don't have to be the fastest, you don't have to be the best, you don't have to be the most incredible runner. You just have to work together with the team. And even the other 3 runners on the team, right? They could have said, well, I'm not as good of a runner as Andrew, so why bother even participating? He's the best runner on the team. I don't need to do anything. Well, no, they had to run their portion of the race. They had to set up the finish where they were able to race into a medal position. And just because he's the strongest member of the team doesn't mean that the other members weren't needed. They had to play their role just as much as he did. Now, the saints of the Bible had to take the baton of God's promises and pass them down to their children, to their relatives, to the next generation that was coming after them. And they ran their own leg of the race, and they finished their task, but the race didn't begin or end with them. Let's look at a passage in Hebrews 11, starting at verse 13. This is what it says. They're talking about the Old Testament heroes and saints. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And these heroes of the faith in the Old Testament, they desired a better country. They knew something better was awaiting them than they could find on earth. because they had received God's promises and they believed in his promises and they knew that God would fulfill his promises. But the thing is, most of them never saw physically the fulfillment of God's promises. Abraham received the covenant from God. God called him out of the country where he was to go to a new place, a place that God would lead him to. And God promised that the land he led him to would be the homeland of the Israelites one day. And Abraham lived in the land, but he lived there as a sojourner, someone who moved about. He never actually owned the land. He didn't own the places that he was. But God promised that one day that land would belong to Israel. And God fulfilled that promise, although it was hundreds of years later. Israel had to go through Egypt. They had to go through the generations of slavery. They had to go through the wilderness. It was literally hundreds of years before that promise was physically fulfilled. But just because Abraham didn't see it personally didn't mean that he wasn't part of the story. He had to take God's promise, God's covenant, and pass it down from generation to generation. He passed the promise to his son Isaac, who passed it to his son, who passed it to his son, who passed it to his son, and so on, generation by generation, as they passed down and taught the promises that God had given them. And just because Abraham didn't see the promise didn't mean that he hadn't received it or that he wasn't part of the story that God was writing. And often, I think in our lives, our culture that we live in, our North American culture, it can be pretty individualistic, right? Where, we're tempted to see our lives in those sprint or marathon metaphors that, I need to do what I need to do. I need to do this. I need to do that. I need to. But in God's economy, it doesn't often work that way. Yes, we each have our role to play, certainly. But it is almost certain that my role began a long time before me and will continue a long time after me. And all of our lives are like that. The story didn't begin with me. It didn't begin with you. It began generations before you. And the story doesn't end with your life. The story doesn't end with you. Our role, each of our roles, is to pass on what we have learned, to pass on the promises of God, to teach others to know God and his promises and his covenants. And God is writing the story. He is writing what is happening. God decides what the finish line is, not me, not you. We just have to play our role as God calls each of us to be part of the team. And while the promise of the homeland for the Israelites was fulfilled physically, as we read about in the Bible, the writer of Hebrews is also talking about another homeland. He's talking about a heavenly home for each and every follower of God, for every follower of Christ. There's also the promise, not just of promises here on earth, but there is a promise of a homeland that is beyond earth. And ultimately, that's where the story is going. The story ends in heaven, one way or the other. And God is promising that there's something better than life on this earth, because he has promised us a homeland in heaven. That's where his promises lead. When we're part of God's story, we're part of sharing that story, that there is a promise of something better than what we see on earth. There's a promise that ends in heaven. There's a hope that Jesus leads us to. Another New Testament example of a baton pass is between Paul and Timothy. You've probably heard of the Apostle Paul and his protege, Timothy. And it was similar for them in that Paul, he's the great missionary, the great ambassador for Christ. He goes on all of these journeys. He's starting churches, teaching the gospel. But the story didn't begin or end with him either. It began with Jesus, went through Paul, and he passed on the baton to Timothy, who was one of his students, one of his followers. He called him a brother in Christ, a son in Christ. and he passed on what he had learned to Timothy and many others, of course, and they continued the journey that Paul had started. Paul didn't begin the journey himself, and he finished his portion, but he never finished even all that he had in mind. There was portions of his life that didn't come in his life. They weren't fulfilled. He had to pass on what he knew, and others would pick up the baton. And I liked this quote of how it talks about Paul and Timothy's ministry. It says, on the other hand, we do not hear Paul asking Timothy to be ready to take up Paul's apostolic tasks if Paul should die. For instance, the envisioned missionary journey to Spain. Paul was an apostle, and Timothy, as we see him finally, is a pastor. They were different. They weren't the same people. It's probably best to conceive the important question of succession in broader terms than the succession of one individual to another's task. Rather, the great agenda of Christ's church requires adaptation and creative responses in each generation. And here, too, the tasks seem to be held in the Lord's hands rather than in the church's jurisdiction. And I think that's a great way to see it. It wasn't about Paul does this, Timothy does that. It's about what is God doing and what is God leading? What is God creating? And it says, again, the great agenda of Christ's church requires adaptation and creative response in each generation. The following generation is not necessarily going to be the same as the previous generation. The tasks may be different in how they're carried out, even though they're part of the same story. And the tasks seem to be held in the Lord's hand rather than in the church's jurisdiction. It's not up to the church to decide what happens, but it's up to Jesus to lead and to guide, and the church to follow and to be part of what Jesus is doing. And of course, another example, one of the most obvious baton passes is from parents to children, because we pass on our heritage, our values, our beliefs to our children. And of course, children have their own personalities, and at some point they make their own choices and they choose their own life path. But whether we like it or not, most of the time we pass on at least some of our beliefs and values to our children, whether we intend to or not. There's a genetic and family resemblance because we spend so much time together, right? It's inevitable. We're going to pass on some things to our children, whether we intend to or not, and whether they're positive or not. Unfortunately, sometimes we pass off negative things as well, but that's because our children get those from us because they've lived with us. And one of the most important things as parents that we can do is raise children who are followers of Christ, not followers of me or followers of themselves or even followers of other people, but followers of Christ first and foremost. So as we've talked about today, the metaphor of the relay race is probably a better way to describe the Christian life than as a sprint or as a marathon, because again, those are individual races, and the relay is a team effort. It's a team race. We are all part of the story that God is writing, each and every single person. You are part of the story that God is writing. When our lap is up in God's timing, we pass the baton to the next person, the next generation, and the story continues because it's God's good story. And God often works generationally, and the fulfillment of his promises sometimes doesn't happen in our lifetimes. It sometimes doesn't happen in our children's or grandchildren's lifetimes. Sometimes it's generations later that God's promises are fulfilled, because we think in lifespans and generations, but God thinks in eternity. He thinks beyond our limited understanding. And Jesus is already and always up to something good, and he invites us to carry the baton on our lap of the journey, to be faithful to what he has called each and every person to do. in their story as God is writing the grand story of life.